The global gender gap is shrinking. The World Economic Forum ranked 134 nations, and the United States is now among the top 20 countries with the slimmest gaps. At the top of the list, the Nordic countries, Iceland, Norway, Finland, and Sweden. Joining us now to talk more about these findings is Saadia Zahidi, co-author of the study and a director at the World Economic Forum. It's good to have you back on the show.
Thank you for having me.
So, nearly 100 years after getting the right to vote in this country, the U.S. now has cracked the top 20. So, how did that finally happen?
You know, part of it is, of course, the increases in terms of labor force participation, the slightly narrowing gaps in terms of women's wages, but mainly this year it's the political empowerment aspect. That's something where the United States used to be below the world average, and finally now the U.S. is a little bit higher in terms of particularly the ministerial level positions.
So the Obama administration's efforts to incorporate women more in the administration are a big part of this progress on your list.
Yes.
Interesting. The Nordic countries, though, still dominating there. What jumped out at me is that among the developed nations, France actually sank on the list. What's happening there?
So in France, you actually have one of the worst perceived gaps between women and men for the same work in terms of wages. So France is 127th in the world out of 134 countries in terms of the wage gap for the same work. That's one thing that's certainly pulling France down. The other thing is, of course, the changes in terms of the cabinet. France used to have a gender equal cabinet, and now that's no longer the case, and that's certainly reflected in the index again.
So tell me the metrics that you judge this along. Is this programs that women are able to tap, or just purely wage growth? Give me the rundown.
We're looking at four different things. So two very big basics. That's health and that's education. For a lot of the rich world countries that are included in the index, of course, those gaps have been closed on both health and also in terms of education, where in fact you start seeing a reverse gap, where a lot of these countries have much higher levels of women in terms of university level enrollment. Then we're looking at economic participation. So we're looking at, of course, just the sheer numbers of people that are participating. We're looking at the wage gaps, and we're looking at whether women are able to make it into senior level positions. And finally, political empowerment.
Now, this isn't a political study. This is actually an economic one. I know Laura Tyson was one of the members who weighed in here as well. Make the economic argument for me, right? Because you have people who say a job's a job these days, regardless of who it goes to. Why does it matter to be more inclusive on a gender basis?
Here's what's happening in most of the world. Women are starting to be as healthy as men. Women are starting to be as educated as men. In many countries, women are starting to be more educated than men. And yet, what tends to happen is, if women are able to make it into the workforce, and that's not always a given, if they are able to make it into the workforce, they're often occupying just the very entry-level positions, and then companies are losing out on their talents. So you've made this investment in somebody, first in terms of their education, then in terms of having them join a particular company or an enterprise, and then you lose them 5 to 10 years down the line because you haven't made it possible for them to combine both family and working life. So that's a loss for the economy as a whole when you add up all of those individuals that are losing out in this way. There is some good news, though. I mean, what we find in the report is over 5 years, 86% of the countries that we've covered have actually made progress. So there is some good news.
Well, we've gotten a lot of conflicting reports as to what's happened in the wake of the recession. Some were calling it a man session, right? That kind of journalistic work had gotten a lot of attention because it was saying the financial world and the construction sectors have been so hard hit in the United States that men have felt the brunt of the recession more so than women. Is that true? Is that what you found?
That's certainly true in some of the data that we found for 2010. So a lot of this data, it takes a while for it to aggregate, and there's a 1 to 2 year lag sometimes. And it's clear that over the last year, women's labor force participation has shrank by less than men's labor force participation has. So some of that is reflecting in our data.
Is it that simple, though? I mean, when it comes to other studies, particularly work at Goldman Sachs, they'll say everything changes when you have a child when it comes to being a woman in the workforce. So you can't really even make an apples-to-apples comparison because you do get punished, essentially, in their work for having a child.
There are countries that have found solutions to that as well. So certainly some of the Nordic countries, the reason they're at the top, the reason that they're the one of the few in the world that have closed over 80% of their gender gap, it's because they have made it possible for things to not be so different for women once they have children, because they have obligatory parental leave where fathers have to take part of that leave as well. So they've put a lot of measures in place so that that penalizing of women doesn't take place.
It's an interesting report is out today. Thank you very much for coming out and sharing the details with us.